The storm didn't just snap the power lines. It snapped the carefully maintained distance I kept between myself and the world. When the blizzard hit the ridge, I thought my only problem was survival. I didn't expect the real danger to be the temperature rising under a wool blanket shared with a woman I barely knew. It started with a simple necessity, preserving core temperature, but ended with a realization that my solitude wasn't strength, just numbness. Sam was about to change the frequency entirely. I've spent 5 years as the head ranger for the Northern Cascades sector because the trees don't ask for anything the sky can't provide. My life runs on a strict cadence: perimeter checks at dawn, equipment maintenance at noon, and silence after sunset. It's a clean, sterile existence. I like the lines straight. I like the variables controlled. But the barometer had been dropping since 0400 hours, a steady, sickening slide that promised violence. This wasn't just a winter squall. It was a pressure system that felt heavy in my teeth, a physical weight pressing down on the granite spine of the mountain. Through the high-powered binoculars, the ridge usually looked like a monochromatic study in gray and white. Today, there was a disruption. A splash of burnt orange gear against the slate rock of Outlook Point. A civilian. My jaw tightened. The advisory had gone out 6 hours ago. The park was closed. I adjusted the focus wheel. A woman stood on the precipice, a massive telephoto lens mounted on a tripod that looked too fragile for the wind shear up here. She wasn't moving. She wasn't bracing against the gale. She was waiting. I keyed the radio, but the static was already chewing on the frequency. I cursed, grabbed my pack, and started the climb. The wind was already stripping the heat from my face, stinging like sand. By the time I reached her, I was out of breath and patience. "You need to clear the area!" I shouted over the roar of the air. "Now!" She remained still, adjusting a dial on her camera body with a gloved hand, her movements precise, almost languid. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were hidden behind ski goggles, but her mouth was set in a calm line. "The light is about to break through the squall line," she said. Her voice was surprisingly clear, pitched perfectly to cut through the wind. "I've been tracking a lynx for 3 days. She's going to move when the pressure drops." "The only thing moving is us," I snapped, stepping into her line of sight. "Code red weather event. That means mandatory evacuation. Who are you?" "Sam," she said, finally looking at me. She pulled the goggles down. Her eyes were dark, amused, and entirely unbothered by the 60-mile-an-hour gusts trying to push us off the mountain. "And you're ruining my shot, Ranger." I stared at her. Most people up here are terrified of the scale of things. They shrink. Sam looked like she was part of the landscape, rooted and observant. I glanced at her gear. Top tier, battered, used. She wasn't a tourist. She was a professional who knew exactly how dangerous this was and didn't care. "Sam," I said, leaning close enough that I could smell the ozone on her jacket. "If we stay here, we die. The temperature is going to drop 40 degrees in the next hour. Your lynx is already in a den. We need to be too." She looked at the sky, then back at her camera. She hesitated, a visible struggle between the artist's greed and the survivalist's logic. Then, the wind changed. It stopped screaming and started howling, a deeper, uglier sound. The first heavy pellets of ice hit her lens. "Okay," she said, collapsing the tripod in one fluid motion. "Lead the way. Patrol cabin," I ordered, pointing down the east face. "Move!" The descent was a blur. The storm didn't arrive. It exploded. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. I had to grab her harness twice to keep her from stumbling over hidden roots. She moved well, though. I'll give her that. No wasted energy. Just efficient, athletic adjustments to the terrain. The physical exertion burned, but the cold was a living thing, hunting for gaps in our layers. We weren't walking anymore. We were leaning into the assault, fighting for every inch of ground. The radio on my shoulder chirped once, a garbled warning from base, And then silence swallowed the signal completely. We were cut off. The only thing tethering me to reality was the rhythmic crunch of her boots next to mine, and the knowledge that the cabin was only 300 yards away. The wind didn't want to let us go. It clawed at our packs, screaming like a wounded animal, until we threw our combined weight against the solid oak door. It gave way with a groan, and we tumbled inside, boots skidding on the rough floorboards. I kicked the door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt. The sudden vacuum made my ears pop. The roaring violence of the ridge was cut off, replaced by the sound of our own ragged breathing and the drip of melting ice hitting the floor. The sensory shift was disorienting. The air inside wasn't warm yet, but it was still. It smelled of deep resinous pine, the metallic tang of ozone clinging to our clothes, and the dusty, unused scent of a space that hadn't held a human in months. It was the smell of a place that demanded you leave your ghosts at the door. I resisted the urge to sag against the wall, refusing to let the relief soften my posture. I went straight into the assessment protocol, my boots thudding heavily as I crossed to the supply locker. Check the seals, check the emergency transponder, check the perimeter integrity. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, a way to keep the adrenaline from turning into the shakes. I turned to tell Sam to stack her gear in the mudroom, but she had already bypassed that logic entirely. She had claimed the central map table. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't looking at me with the wide, grateful eyes of a rescued civilian. She was methodically stripping the wet protective covers off her lenses, her movements calm and precise. She treated the lenses with more tenderness than most people treated their children. I noticed the scratches on the casing, the battle scars of 1,000 other storms she had apparently weathered without me. "Don't put wet gear on the nav charts," I said, the command coming out sharper than I intended. My voice sounded too loud in this small room, bouncing off the timber walls. Sam paused, a microfiber cloth hovering over the glass. She looked up, pushing a damp lock of dark hair out of her eyes. Her expression wasn't apologetic. It was curious. "The charts are laminated, Ranger," she said, her voice a low, smooth contrast to my clipped tone. "And this glass costs more than my truck. I'm not putting it on the floor." I watched her for a moment, the defiance registering not as rudeness, but as a different kind of discipline. She stripped off her heavy outer coat, revealing a fitted thermal layer that hugged the lines of her shoulders. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like she was setting up a workspace. The cabin was 12 by 12, a standard government-issue box. With 2 bunks, a wood stove, and the table, the floor space was non-existent. We were 2 women from vastly different worlds forced into a closet. Every time I moved to check a window latch, I had to step into her personal space. Every time she shifted to reach into her pack, the air between us compressed. I could smell the rain on her skin, a fresh, sharp scent that cut through the musty pine. "We ration everything, starting now," I said, laying out the foil packets of emergency food. "Water is limited. Heat is limited. We run a tight ship until the weather breaks." Sam leaned back against the table, crossing her arms. A faint, amused smile played on her lips. "You really don't know how to turn it off, do you?" she asked. "We're stuck, Elena, not under siege. I have a flask of decent whiskey and a bag of trail mix that actually tastes like food. Maybe we just exist for a minute?" "Protocol keeps people alive," I countered, my back stiffening. "Chaos gets people killed." "Sometimes chaos is the only thing that's real," she replied softly, her gaze holding mine, unflinching. I opened my mouth to argue, to reassert the hard lines of my authority, but the cabin answered for me. The steady electric hum of the perimeter heater, our only link to modern comfort, stuttered. The red pilot light on the wall console flickered once, violently, and then died. The gray twilight of the storm rushed in, swallowing the cabin's artificial warmth in a single heartbeat. The silence deepened, heavy and cold, leaving us alone in the dark. When the electric hum of the heater died, the cabin didn't just get quiet. It got hostile. The air began to thin and sharpen immediately, a free fall that I could feel on the back of my neck. We weren't just in a shelter anymore. We were inside a rapidly cooling lung. The storm outside battered the walls with renewed fury, but the threat was now inside with us, invisible and biting. I moved by memory to the mantel, my fingers brushing against the cold glass of the kerosene lantern. The strike of the match was loud, a sharp rasp that made Sam look up. The sulfur flare was brief, followed by the steady, warm glow as the wick caught. The light changed everything. The harsh, flat gray of the storm was pushed back to the edges of the room, replaced by a flickering, amber intimacy. It threw long, dancing shadows against the logs, turning the cramped space into something that felt less like a cage and more like a den. It softened the hard lines of Sam's face, painting her in sepia tones. She looked up from her equipment, the golden light catching the curve of her cheekbone and the dark, intelligent intensity of her eyes. For a second, the storm felt 1,000 miles away. Then a draft cut through the room like a knife, reminding me that aesthetics wouldn't keep our blood moving. "We need to get out of these wet layers," I said, my voice sounding rougher than I intended in the sudden quiet. Hypothermia doesn't care about modesty. I didn't wait for her response. I turned my back, though in a 12 by 12 room, privacy is a polite fiction. I unbuckled my utility belt, the heavy leather thudding onto the table. Then came the parka, the stiff outer shell, and the damp uniform shirt. I worked down to my thermal base layer, the air biting at my skin the moment the fabric left it. I've always treated my body like a piece of government-issued equipment. Keep it serviced, keep it functional. Don't worry about the paint job. It's a tool for hauling gear up switchbacks and digging fire lines. It's scarred, strong, and entirely unconcerned with being looked at. But when I turned back to the stove to open the flue, I felt the weight of a gaze on my back. It wasn't the assessing look of a supervisor or the blank stare of a tourist. It was heavy, warm, and deliberate. Sam had shed her outer shell too. She was wearing a thin, dark tank top that clung to her, revealing arms that were defined and capable. She stood perfectly still, watching me. "This cabin has ghosts," Sam said quietly, her voice low. She wasn't looking at the walls. She was looking at the way I held the kindling. "Or maybe it's just you haunting it." "It's a patrol station," I muttered, shoving paper and dry pine into the iron belly of the stove. "It doesn't have a soul. It has an inventory list." "You chose this," she pressed, stepping closer. She was holding her wet coat, but she didn't move to hang it up yet. 5 years on the ridge. That's a lot of silence for one person. What are you hiding from down there in the valley?" "I'm not hiding. I'm working." I struck another match, watching the fire catch. The flames licked up, casting a sudden bright heat against my shins. People are messy. Trees are consistent. "Trees don't keep you warm," she countered. She moved into the small radius of heat the stove was beginning to throw. The space was shrinking. To stay warm, we had to be close. She hung her coat on the line above the stove, her body stretching, the movement fluid and unself-conscious. When she lowered her arms, she was standing less than 2 feet from me. The smell of wet wool and kerosene was thick, but underneath it, I caught that scent of her again. Warm skin and rain. We stood there, 2 strangers stripped of our armor, hovering over a small iron box of fire while the world ended outside. The physical distance between us had collapsed from miles to inches. I could see the pulse in her neck. I could see a small mole near her collarbone. I stiffened, my instinct to retreat warring with the biological imperative to stay near the heat. "It's going to get colder before it gets better," I said, staring at the fire instead of her eyes. "I know," Sam replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. That's usually how the good stories start. The cold was already seeping up through the floorboards, finding the gaps in the old wood, wrapping around our ankles like icy water. It was a physical pressure, rising from the ground up, demanding we make a tactical decision about the night. Sam reached into the battered side pocket of her pack and pulled out a silver flask. It was scarred and dented, a veteran of other mountains and other storms. She unscrewed the cap with a slow, deliberate twist, the faint metallic screech cutting through the low roar of the wind outside. The scent hit me instantly. Peat, oak, and something sharp like iodine. It was a smell that didn't belong in a government patrol cabin. It belonged in dark bars and warm beds, places where the rules were softer. "Medicinal," she said, her voice dropping into the quiet space between us. She took a pull, her throat working smoothly, then held it out to me. My handbook lists alcohol as a prohibited substance during active duty. It also lists evacuation protocols that we had already failed. The cold was a physical weight on my shoulders now, a dull ache settling into the marrow. I took the flask. The metal was warm from her hands, a borrowed heat that felt shockingly intimate against my cold fingers. I took a swallow. The whiskey was rough and excellent. It burned a line of fire straight down my center, a golden liquid heat that made my eyes water and forced a sharp exhale from my lungs. "Better?" she asked, watching me. "Warmer," I admitted, handing it back. "Don't tell headquarters. Your secret is safe with the mountain," she murmured, taking another sip before capping it. We sat on the floor, our backs against the rough-hewn logs of the lower bunk, legs stretched out toward the dying fire. The stove was a small black iron box, and the heat it threw was shrinking by the minute. The sensory details of the room became hyper-focused in the dim light. I could smell the damp wool of our drying socks, the resin of the pine walls, and the underlying steady scent of the woman sitting 6 inches away from me. "So," I said, the alcohol loosening the knot in my chest just enough to let curiosity in. "Why this? Why drag 50 pounds of glass up a ridgeline in a blizzard? You could take portraits in a studio where the climate is controlled." Sam turned the flask over in her hands, catching the firelight. "Studios are dead," she said, her tone dismissive. "Everything is arranged. Everything is predicted. I like the wild because it doesn't care if I'm there or not. The lynx moves when she wants to move. The storm breaks when it wants to break. My job isn't to control it, Elena. My job is just to be awake when it happens." "I like the control," I countered, looking at the straight lines of the floorboards. "I like knowing that if I check the perimeter holds. I like knowing that the map matches the terrain." Sam shifted, turning her body fully toward me. She wasn't looking at the fire anymore. She was looking at me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was the photographer's gaze, focused, assessing, framing. I felt suddenly exposed, as if she were adjusting her aperture to let more light in, seeing past the uniform and the badge to the exhausted woman underneath. "You have a face for high contrast," she observed, her voice low and contemplative. "Hard lines, shadows. You wear your solitude like armor, Ranger, but armor is heavy. Don't you ever want to put it down?" "It keeps me safe," I said, though the words felt thin. "It keeps you dormant," she corrected gently. "Like those seeds that need a wildfire to crack open. You think you're preserving yourself, but you're just waiting. And waiting is a long way from living." The word dormant hung in the air, uncomfortably accurate. I looked at her, really looked at her. The amber light softened the angle of her jaw, but her eyes were unflinching. She saw me, not the ranger, not the authority figure, but the person who had spent 5 years hiding in the trees. She reached out to place the flask on the floor between us. I moved my hand to stabilize it. Our timing was off, or maybe it was perfect. My fingers brushed against the back of her hand. It wasn't a spark, it was a jolt. A static shock from the dry air and the wool, sharp and audible. We both flinched, but held our ground. Her skin was rough, warm, and alive. The contact sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. For a second, the air felt thick, charged with a sudden, terrifying voltage. "Static," she whispered, but she didn't move her hand. "Yeah," I breathed. "Static." The fire popped loudly, a log collapsing into ash. and the light in the room dimmed instantly. I looked toward the wood box. It was empty. The whiskey's burn was fading, and the deep freeze, the dangerous reality of the storm, was reclaiming the room. We were out of fuel. The stove ticked loudly as the metal contracted, a dying metronome marking the end of our heat source. The last ember faded from a vibrant orange to a dull, ashy gray, and the difference in the room was immediate. The freeze didn't just return. It rushed in like water filling a sinking ship, pressing against the windows and seeping through the chinking in the logs. It was a physical weight, heavy and aggressive. I could see my breath now, a white plume ghosting in the dim light of the lantern. "That's it then," Sam said. Her voice remained level, as if she were calculating in exposure time. She looked at the empty wood box, then at the frost beginning to crystallize on the inside of the window pane. "We have maybe 20 minutes before the ambient temperature in here matches the outside. And outside is currently 20 below. We have the emergency rations," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Calories generate heat. Calories won't stop hypothermia, Elena. Not tonight. You know the math as well as I do. Probably better." I did know the math. It was ingrained in me, printed on page 42 of the Ranger Field Handbook, in bold, uncompromising text. In the event of critical fuel failure and isolation, shared body heat is the primary survival mechanism. It was a sterile, clinical sentence designed for reports and training seminars. It didn't account for the reality of shivering next to a woman who had already dismantled my defenses with a flask of whiskey and a few pointed questions. "The bunk," I said. It felt like a concession, a surrender of my command. "The bunk," she agreed. She stood up, dusting off her pants with maddening practicality. There was no hesitation in her movement, no awkward pause or flushed cheeks. To her, this was just another variable in the wild, like rain or rough terrain that had to be managed. "Top or bottom?" "Bottom is wider," I said, my voice tight. "Marginally, bottom it is." She moved her camera bag to the floor, treating the expensive gear with less care than she was currently treating the situation. I walked to the supply locker, my boots heavy on the floorboards. I pulled out the standard issue wool blanket. It was a beast of a thing. Heavy, scratchy, and smelling of mothballs and long-term storage. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to keep people alive when they had no business being alive. I held it like a shield. "That looks exfoliating," Sam noted, eyeing the coarse gray fabric. "It retains 80% of its thermal properties even when damp," I recited, retreating into the safety of facts. "We keep the base layers on, boots off. We need maximum contact for thermal transfer. Physics dictates that air gaps are the enemy." "You make it sound like a corporate merger," she said, sitting on the edge of the narrow mattress. The springs groaned under her weight. She began to unlace her boots, her fingers nimble and quick. "Come on, Ranger. The freeze is setting in. Strip the boots." I sat on the opposite end of the cot. It was absurdly narrow. A shelf, really. I unlaced my boots, the leather stiff with cold, and kicked them off. My socks were thick wool, but the floor was already stealing the feeling from my feet. "Okay," Sam said. She swung her legs up, scooting back against the wall. "I'll take the inside. You take the edge. You're the one with the weapon, after all. You can guard us from the snow yetis." "There are no yetis in the Cascades," I muttered, climbing in. The mattress dipped, throwing our weight together. There was no her side or my side. The space was absolute in its limitations. To fit, we had to fit together. I lay down on my side, facing away from the wall, away from her. "Inefficient," Sam murmured behind me. "Turn around, back to front. Like spoons in a drawer. It maximizes surface area." She was right. It was just logic. Cold, hard logic. I turned, settling my back against her front. The contact was immediate and shocking. Even through our thermal layers, I could feel the solid, furnace-like reality of her body. She was hotter than me, a steady fire against my spine. "We need the wool," she said. I pulled the heavy blanket up over us. It settled like a lead apron, sealing us into a capsule of dark, scratchy warmth. It trapped the scent of her, the whiskey, the rain, the skin, right there with me. "Arm?" she asked. "Over," I said. She draped her arm over my waist. Her hand came to rest flat against my stomach, just above my belt line. It was heavy, grounding. Her knees tucked into the backs of my knees. We were a puzzle clicking into place, locked together by the geometry of survival. "Relax, Elena," she whispered, her breath stirring the hair at the nape of my neck. "I'm not going to steal your secrets while you sleep." "I don't have secrets. You're vibrating like a tension wire. It's just heat. Take it. I'm fine." "The lamp," she reminded me softly. I reached out, my hand finding the cold metal of the lantern base on the floor. I twisted the valve. The amber light sputtered and vanished. The darkness that followed wasn't empty. It was full of us, amplifying the sound of the wind screaming outside and the terrified, rhythmic thud of my own heart against her arm. The darkness didn't erase the room. It just erased my ability to ignore what was happening. Visuals are easy to dismiss. You can look away. You can focus on a loose thread in the blanket or a knot in the wood. But in the pitch black, robbed of sight, my world narrowed down to a single, overwhelming data point: the energy radiating from the woman pressed against my back. It wasn't just temperature. It was a physical frequency, a steady, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the layers of thermal cotton separating us. I lay there like a plank of wood, muscles locked, breath shallow. I was trying to hold myself in a state of suspended animation, trying to maintain a microscopic layer of air between my spine and her chest. It was a ridiculous, exhausting effort. Physics, as I had so confidently quoted earlier, was winning. Gravity wanted us together. The dip in the mattress wanted us together. And terrifyingly, my own frozen blood wanted us together. Sam was heavy. Not in a burdensome way, but in a solid, undeniable way. Her arm, draped over my waist, wasn't passive. It was an anchor. Her hand lay flat against my stomach, her fingers spread wide, and through the fabric, I could feel the individual pads of her fingertips. They weren't moving, but they felt aware. Every time I inhaled, my diaphragm expanded against her palm. Every time I exhaled, her grip seemed to settle deeper, claiming the space. The sensory input was drowning me. Without the distraction of sight, my sense of smell went into overdrive. The scratchy wool blanket created a tent, trapping the air. And in that enclosed space, Sam smelled like a storm that had come indoors. It was a complex, heady mix: the sharp chemical tang of lens cleaner, the damp ozone scent of melted snow, and beneath it all, something rich and warm and devastatingly human. It was the smell of skin that had been working, skin that was alive. It bypassed my logic centers entirely and hit the primitive part of my brain that had been dormant for 5 years. "You're still holding your breath, Elena," Sam whispered. Her voice didn't come from across a room this time. It vibrated directly against my shoulder blades, a low rumble that I felt in my own chest cavity. It was intimate in a way that felt illegal. "I'm conserving oxygen," I lied, the words sounding brittle in the dark. "You're fighting the blanket," she murmured. Her thumb brushed back and forth against my side, a tiny, unconscious movement that sent a shockwave straight to my toes. "Let the wool do the work. You don't have to be the heater. You just have to be the fuel." I tried to maintain the rigid tension, the professional distance I wore like a uniform. But the cold was a relentless siege engine, and Sam was the only fortress left. My body betrayed me, slowly, then all at once. My shoulders dropped, the muscles in my back unspooled. I exhaled, a long, shaky breath that emptied my lungs. And in that emptiness, I sank backward. I molded against her. The contact was absolute. Her chest against my back, her thighs against my thighs, her knees tucked into the bend of mine. It was a total eclipse of my solitude. The shivering that had been living in my marrow for the last hour finally stopped, replaced by a slow, creeping thaw, that started at the points of contact and spread outward like ink in water. It was terrifying. The survival excuse, the medical necessity of shared body heat, began to evaporate, leaving something much more dangerous in its wake. This wasn't just thermodynamics. This was comfort. This was the sudden, aching realization of how long it had been since another human being had held me without wanting something from me. Sam wasn't asking for a permit. She wasn't asking for directions. She was just there, solid, warm, present. The silence of the cabin amplified everything. Outside, the wind was a distant, muffled roar, but inside the wool cocoon, the world was microscopic. I could hear the slow, steady cadence of her heart beating against my back. It was slower than mine, unhurried, calm. It made me want to match it. It made me want to stop running. "Better?" she asked, her breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my neck. "Warmer," I managed to whisper. My voice was barely a sound. "Good." She shifted slightly, adjusting her hip, and the friction of our bodies moving together was a spark in a room full of gasoline. "Go to sleep, Ranger. The storm isn't going anywhere." But sleep was impossible. The line between survival and desire is thinner than a thermal shirt, and we had just crossed it. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, feeling the terrifying, wonderful weight of her arm, and realized that for the first time in a decade, I wasn't just freezing. I was ignited. And I didn't want to put the fire out. Then, the cramp hit. A sharp, biting spasm in my calf, a protest from the climb. I gasped, instinctively jerking my leg. The movement threw off our balance on the narrow cot. I tried to correct it, to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. I rolled, trying to stretch the muscle, and in the chaos of the blanket and the dark, I ended up turning. I stopped. I wasn't facing the wall anymore. I was on my back, half turned, and Sam had shifted with me. We were no longer spooning. We were face to face in the suffocating electric dark, our noses inches apart, sharing the same pocket of air. The darkness between us wasn't empty. It was a magnetic field. Being face to face in that narrow bunk changed the physics of the room entirely. When we were back to front, I could pretend she was just a radiator in human shape. But now, with our noses inches apart, sharing the same recycled pocket of air under the wool, the pretense evaporated. I couldn't see her. The cabin was absolute pitch black, but my other senses were painting a picture so vivid it made my chest ache. I could feel the rhythm of her breath hitting my chin, rhythmic and steady. I could smell the faint, sharp scent of the whiskey she'd swallowed, mixing with the clean, salt and rain smell of her skin. "You're awake," Sam whispered. It wasn't a question. Her voice was a low vibration that I felt in my collarbone before I heard it in my ears. It was stripped of the teasing irony she'd used earlier. In the dark, she sounded serious. "Leg cramp," I lied again, though the muscle had long since relaxed. "The climb." "You're a terrible liar, Elena," she murmured. I felt her shift, the mattress springs groaning softly. "You're awake because the air in here is thick enough to chew on." She was right. The tension was a physical pressure, heavier than the storm outside. I lay there, rigid, trying to figure out where to put my hands. They were currently tucked against my own chest, a defensive wall, while hers were still somewhere in the darkness between us. "Why do you do it?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could check them against my internal sensor. "The photos, the risk. Why is it so important to catch a lynx that doesn't want to be seen?" There was a pause. A beat of silence where the only sound was the wind hammering against the log walls. Then, her hand moved. I felt her fingers brush against my forearm, a light, ghostly touch that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Because things disappear," Sam said softly. "The light changes, the animal moves, the storm breaks. If you blink, you miss it. And if you miss it, it's like it never happened. I take the photos to prove that for 1 second, the world was exactly that wild, and I was there to witness it." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Witnessing. I thought about my last 5 years, the endless patrols, the pristine, empty logbooks, the solitary dinners. I had been witnessing the mountain, sure, but no one had been witnessing me. I had erased myself so thoroughly that I wasn't sure I even existed outside of the uniform. I was a ghost haunting my own life, efficient and invisible. "I think I disappeared a long time ago," I whispered. The confession was terrifying. I hadn't said that out loud to anyone, not even myself. "No," Sam said. Her hand moved again. This time, it wasn't a brush. It was a landing. Her palm found the curve of my waist, sliding under the heavy wool blanket to rest against the thermal fabric of my shirt. The weight of her hand was shocking, a brand against my side. "You're right here. You've just been in suspension." "Stasis is safe," I breathed. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "Safety is boring," she countered. Her thumb moved, tracing a slow, deliberate arc over my hip bone. It wasn't a comforting gesture anymore. It was a question. It was a mapmaker charting new territory. "And you don't feel boring to me, Elena. You feel coiled." That word shattered the last of my resistance. Coiled. Yes, that was it. I had been wound tight for years, holding everything in, bracing for a disaster that never came. And now, under the rough scratch of a government blanket, with a stranger's hand burning a hole through my defenses, the coil was springing loose. My body woke up. It wasn't a slow waking. It was a gasp of air after being underwater. The blood rushed to the surface of my skin, making me sensitive to every texture. The rough wool, the soft cotton of her shirt, the calluses on her fingertips. The numbness I had cultivated as a survival strategy disintegrated. I wasn't a ranger anymore. I was just a woman in the dark, starving for touch. I moved my hand. It was a terrifying risk, a leap off a cliff without checking the landing zone. I reached out and found her shoulder in the dark. The muscle was solid, tense. I slid my hand down her arm, feeling the strength there, until my fingers laced with hers on the mattress between us. "Sam," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I've got you," she answered. She pulled me closer. The gap between us closed. Her leg hooked over mine, a heavy, grounding weight. Her forehead rested against mine. "Just breathe. Let the storm do what it wants. We're right here." The wind outside shrieked, a violent crescendo that shook the cabin frame. But for the first time all night, I didn't care about the perimeter. The real storm had finally broken inside the room, washing away 5 years of ice, leaving me raw, terrified, and finally, completely awake. The light was the first thing. Not the amber glow of the lantern or the gray misery of the storm, but a blinding, brilliant white that pushed through the frosted glass of the cabin window. The blizzard had scoured the sky clean, leaving behind a morning so bright it felt aggressive. I squeezed my eyes shut against it, trying to hold on to the dark for just a few seconds longer. Because the dark was where the safety was. The dark was where the line between ranger and woman had blurred into something soft and unrecognizable. But the morning doesn't care about your comfort. It demands you open your eyes and look at what you've done. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The physics of the bunk had changed again during the night. We weren't just sharing space anymore. We were tangled in a way that defied the geometry of the narrow cot. My right leg was hooked between hers, a heavy, anchoring weight. Her arm was no longer just draped over me. It was tucked under my neck, her hand resting possessively on my shoulder. The scratchy wool blanket had been kicked down to our waists, unnecessary now. The warmth wasn't coming from the stove. It was generated by the friction of two bodies that had spent 6 hours learning the map of each other's warmth. I lay there, breathing in the shallow, still air. Usually, my internal clock is a precise instrument. 0500 hours. Wake. 0510. Boots on. 0515. Coffee and perimeter check. But the clock in my head was silent. The urgency of the patrol, the obsession with the cadence, It all felt distant, like a radio signal from a station I wasn't tuned into anymore. I didn't want to check the seals on the door. I didn't want to assess the snowpack. I wanted to stay in this heavy, languid suspension, where the only responsibility I had was to not wake the woman breathing against my collarbone. Then, the rhythm changed. The steady rise and fall of Sam's chest against my ribs hitched, then deepened. She was awake. I felt the shift in her tension, the slow transition from sleep to consciousness. Most people jerk awake, disoriented. Sam woke up the same way she took photos, with immediate, calm focus. She remained anchored, making no move to reclaim her side of the mattress. She shifted slightly, her forehead pressing against the side of my neck, her breath warm and damp on my skin. "The wind stopped," she murmured. Her voice was rough with sleep, a low texture that scraped pleasantly against my nerves. "The front moved east," I replied. My own voice sounded foreign, softer, less commanded. The protocol says we should assess the descent route immediately." "Elena." She said my name like it was a physical touch. She pulled back just enough to look at me. The morning light was ruthless, illuminating every line of exhaustion on my face, every stray hair, every crack in the armor. I wanted to flinch. I wanted to pull the blanket up, but her gaze held me pinned. Her eyes were clear, dark, and unflinching. There was no morning after awkwardness, no apology in the set of her mouth. She looked at me with the same intensity she'd used on the storm, like I was a rare phenomenon she had waited a lifetime to catch in the right light. "We have time," she said. It wasn't a question. "The snow needs to settle. Avalanche risk is high on the descent." It was a valid tactical point. It was also a blatant excuse. And for the first time in 5 years, I took the excuse. "Avalanche risk," I repeated, the lie tasting sweet. "Right." She smiled, a slow, lazy curving of her lips that made my stomach flip. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw, her thumb brushing over the pulse point that was beating too fast. "You're still warm," she noted softly. "The ice didn't get in." "No," I whispered, leaning infinitesimally into her touch. "It didn't." I felt my body not as a tool for hiking or a machine for survival, but as something alive. The ache in my muscles wasn't from the climb. It was from the tension of wanting. The flush in my skin wasn't a fever. It was a response. I was thawing. The numbness that had protected me for so long was melting, running off me like the water dripping from the eaves outside. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. Then, the world broke in. A burst of static cut through the silence like a gunshot. The radio on the floor, dormant for 12 hours, crackled to life. "Unit 4 to base. Unit 4, do you copy? Status check." The sound was jarring, violent. It was the voice of the job, the voice of the rules. Sam's hand froze on my cheek. We both stared at the black plastic box as if it were a bomb. The spell didn't break, but it cracked. The outside world had found us. I keyed the mic, and the copper taste of duty filled my mouth. "Unit 4 secure. Weather clearing. Proceeding to extraction point." My voice was steady, the practiced cadence of the job, but my hand shook as I released the button. The return to protocol felt like putting on wet clothes, necessary, rigid, and suddenly uncomfortable. We packed in silence. The efficiency was back, the gear disappearing into bags with practiced speed. But the energy in the room had shifted. Yesterday, we were two professionals negotiating space in a crisis. Today, every time we passed each other, the air thickened, heavy with the memory of the night. I folded the wool blanket, the rough fabric scratching my hands. It should have just been government property, a line item on an inventory list. Instead, as I pressed the air out of the fold, I caught the scent of her again, sandalwood and skin, trapped in the fibers. It made my breath hitch. I shoved it into the locker, slamming the metal door a little too hard, trying to seal the memory away. It didn't work. The ghost of her warmth was already under my skin. Sam watched me. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. She handed me a lens cap she'd left on the table. Our fingers brushed. The static shock was gone, replaced by a magnetic pull that made it physically difficult to let go. The door opened onto a world that had been scrubbed clean. The storm had left 3 feet of fresh powder, smoothing out the jagged edges of the ridge into soft, deceptive curves. The descent was technical. I took the lead, cutting the trail, my boots breaking the crust with a rhythmic crunch. Usually, I scan for hazards: loose rock, ice patches, unstable drifts. Today, I was hyper-aware of the sound of her boots behind me. I wasn't just patrolling a sector, I was guiding her. The silence of the woods felt different. It wasn't the silence of emptiness anymore. It was the silence of anticipation. The trees weren't just timber. They were witnesses to the change in me. We reached the trailhead 2 hours later. Her truck was a mound of white in the lot, buried but waiting. We dug it out together, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the looming goodbye. When the metal was finally cleared and the engine coughed to life, the reality of the separation hit me hard. This was the danger zone. This was where people blamed the altitude, or the adrenaline, or the fear of freezing for what happened in the dark. I braced myself for the apology, for the "it was just survival" speech that would put the walls back up. Sam leaned against the driver's side door, one hand on the handle. She didn't look at the mountain. She looked at me. She wasn't wearing her goggles. Her eyes were stripped of any professional distance, dark and amused. "I'm going to develop these," she said, tapping the camera bag on her shoulder. "The shots from the ridge. But I think the best thing I found up there wasn't the links." "The light was good," I deflected, falling back on safe, neutral language. Sam laughed, a low, warm sound that melted the last of my resolve. "The light was revealing," she corrected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a page torn from her field notebook. She pressed it into my gloved hand. "I'm in town for 2 more weeks," she said. "I need a guide for the lower valley. Someone who knows where the hidden things are. I hear you're the best." She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need to. She climbed into the cab, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that should have felt like an ending. But as I looked down at the paper in my hand, a name, a number, and a time written in bold, confident ink, I knew it wasn't. I watched her truck navigate the switchbacks until it was just a speck against the pines. I stood alone in the parking lot, the cold air biting at my cheeks. Years ago, this moment would have been a relief, the solitude returning, the order restored. But as I turned back toward the ranger station, the silence felt incomplete. I touched the paper in my pocket, feeling the sharp corner through my glove. The storm had broken the power lines, yes, but it had reconnected something far more vital. I wasn't asleep anymore. The shell had cracked, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't looking forward to the quiet. I was looking forward to the noise of living. The engine started, but the connection held. The truck disappeared around the bend, but the silence she left behind wasn't empty anymore. It was vibrating with the promise of her return. If you've ever found heat in the coldest places, subscribe to follow the rest of the journey, and let me know in the comments, what's the one moment that finally woke you up?